The restaurant was buzzing with soft conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle hum of background music. It was one of those elegant places where families came to celebrate, where businessmen closed million-dollar deals, and where every detail, from the polished silverware to the perfectly folded napkins, spoke of luxury. At one of the corner tables, however, all eyes began to turn. A young boy was screaming, his voice echoing across the room, breaking the calm atmosphere. He wasn't just upset. He was overwhelmed, lost in a world that felt too loud, too bright, and too much for him to handle. The boy was autistic, and in that moment he couldn't hide his pain. Beside him sat his father, a well-dressed man whose face was instantly recognizable to many. He was a billionaire, known for his power, wealth, and influence. People whispered about his business empire, his grand lifestyle, and the way he commanded every room he walked into. But here, sitting helplessly across from his son, he looked nothing like the untouchable figure people knew. His eyes carried exhaustion. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to soothe the boy, but nothing seemed to work. For once, money couldn't fix the problem in front of him. Around them the atmosphere grew tense. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some frowning, others whispering under their breath. A few rolled their eyes, irritated that their perfect evening was being disturbed. The waiters exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. It wasn't just about the screaming, it was about who was at the table. No one dared to step forward. No one wanted to risk offending the billionaire or doing something wrong. The father's reputation was enough to make everyone cautious, but at the same time, the boy's cries were impossible to ignore. The boy's distress only grew louder, his small hands clutching at his shirt, his breathing heavy as tears ran down his face. His father leaned closer, whispering words no one else could hear, but the child couldn't calm down. The billionaire closed his eyes briefly, his mask slipping as the weight of helplessness pressed down on him. For all his power, here was a battle he couldn't win alone. And that's when something unexpected happened. From the far side of the restaurant, a young waitress quietly set down the tray she was carrying. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, she wasn't someone with status or power, but she had been watching closely. Unlike everyone else who looked at the boy with judgment or discomfort, her eyes carried something different, understanding. She took a deep breath and walked toward the table. Every step she took seemed to freeze the room. People stared, shocked that she would dare to approach. The billionaire himself looked up, surprised, almost offended, as she stopped right beside them. For a moment she didn't say anything. She simply knelt down to the boy's level, her voice soft, her hands steady. What she did next left the entire restaurant stunned. No one expected it. No one could have imagined that a simple waitress, someone most guests had barely noticed, was about to change everything in a way that even the billionaire would never forget. Would her act calm the boy, or spark a reaction no one saw coming? The answer would leave everyone in the restaurant breathless. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the waitress crouched down beside the boy. Her calmness was a sharp contrast to the restless murmurs and disapproving stares around them. She didn't flinch at his loud cries or at the way he pulled at his shirt in frustration. Instead, she spoke in a low, steady voice, one that only the boy could truly hear. There was something in her tone that wasn't rehearsed, something gentle and real. The billionaire, still caught off guard, studied her carefully. He wasn't used to people approaching him this way, uninvited and without fear of who he was. Most people froze under his gaze or fumbled over their words, but this waitress didn't look at him with awe or intimidation. Her attention was completely on his son. For the first time that evening, the boy's cries faltered, not stopping, but shifting into softer, uneven sobs. The billionaire noticed it instantly, this tiny change, and for the first time, his own heart skipped with a flicker of hope. Around them, the atmosphere remained tense. Some guests still whispered, wondering why no one had escorted the waitress back to her duties. Others leaned in, curious about what she was doing that none of the staff or even the boy's father had managed. The staff at the counter froze too, unsure whether to interrupt or allow this strange moment to play out. It was rare to see someone defy the unspoken rules of power in such an elite place. And yet, there she was, with her plain uniform and warm eyes, doing what no one else dared. The billionaire leaned back slightly in his chair, his mind racing. He had faced boardroom battles, financial crises, and ruthless competitors, but nothing left him feeling as powerless as his own child's struggles. His son's autism had shaped every part of their lives. The boy's outbursts, the sudden meltdowns, the endless stares from strangers. It all weighed heavily on him, though he rarely showed it. Money had bought the best therapists, the most expensive programs, and even private schools, but none of it could shield them from moments like this. Tonight, under the bright lights of the restaurant, every ounce of his strength seemed to collapse. And yet, watching this waitress, something inside him stirred. She didn't have degrees on her wall or an empire behind her name, but she seemed to carry a quiet knowledge, a way of seeing his son that most people ignored. It was unsettling and fascinating all at once. The boy's cries still echoed, though softer now, and the waitress slowly reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out something small, almost ordinary, but the way she handled it caught the billionaire's attention. Guests craned their necks, trying to see, their curiosity mixing with disbelief. Why was she doing this? How could she think a simple gesture could succeed where so much had failed? The billionaire's jaw tightened, torn between stepping in and letting her continue. His son's wide eyes followed the waitress's hand, his sobs hiccuping between breaths. The air grew heavier, as if the entire room was waiting for a single answer. What connection did this young waitress have to his son? Why did she seem to understand him in a way no one else ever had? The billionaire's mind swirled with questions he couldn't voice, but deep down, he knew something was about to happen, something that would change not only this night, but perhaps everything he thought he knew about his son's world. The waitress leaned closer, her words still soft and steady, and the boy's little hands paused mid-motion. For the first time, the restaurant grew silent, not from his cries but from anticipation. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the table, waiting to see if this ordinary young woman would succeed where power and wealth had failed. And then, in the middle of that silence, the boy's reaction stunned everyone. It wasn't what they expected, and it left the billionaire frozen in his chair, staring at the waitress as though she had just revealed a secret no one else could understand. The boy's sudden shift in behavior left the entire restaurant in shock. His cries didn't disappear completely, but there was a noticeable change. His breathing slowed, his little body relaxed ever so slightly, and his eyes locked onto the small object the waitress held. It was nothing expensive or glamorous, just a simple wooden keychain shaped like a tiny bird. She rolled it gently in her hand, letting the light bounce off its smooth surface. Somehow, that small motion caught his attention when nothing else had worked. The billionaire leaned forward, unable to hide his surprise. He had seen countless professionals struggle to calm his son, yet this young woman had managed to create a fragile pause in just a few moments. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Who was she? Why did she seem to understand what his son needed when so many others couldn't? At nearby tables, whispers continued to spread. Some diners were annoyed that the evening had been disrupted so long, while others watched with a quiet sense of awe. The staff remained frozen, caught between their instinct to intervene and their curiosity about what might happen next. The tension in the air was thick, as though everyone was waiting for a storm to either pass or explode. The billionaire's mind drifted back to the many battles he had faced as a father. Behind the walls of his luxurious mansion, nights like this were not rare. His son's meltdowns often left him pacing halls in frustration, wishing he could trade all his wealth for a moment of peace in his child's world. He had faced judgmental looks from teachers, awkward silence at social gatherings, and endless advice from people who didn't understand. Now here he was in a public place, watching his son cling to a waitress's small act of kindness. It stirred something deep inside him, a mix of gratitude and discomfort. But not everyone saw it that way. A group of businessmen sitting near the entrance exchanged disapproving looks, clearly annoyed at the disruption. One of them muttered under his breath about how people like that shouldn't bring children to fine dining restaurants. The billionaire caught the words, and his chest tightened with anger. He was used to criticism, but when it involved his son, it felt different, it cut deeper. He wanted to stand up and confront them, but before he could move, the waitress shifted slightly, her calm voice redirecting his son's focus. It was almost as if she had sensed his rising frustration too. For the first time, the billionaire wondered if she had her own story, some hidden connection to autism, or perhaps a sibling or child she had learned to comfort in similar ways. There was something in her eyes, a quiet patience that didn't come from training but from lived experience. He found himself wanting to ask her, but pride held him back. After all, how could a billionaire admit that a waitress had done something he couldn't? Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the restaurant manager had been alerted about the scene. His face was tense as he debated whether to step in. He worried about upsetting such a powerful client, yet he also knew the billionaire's reputation for expecting control and order. Allowing a waitress to interfere might be seen as overstepping. The staff whispered nervously, wondering if she would lose her job for what she had done, even if it worked. Back at the table, the boy reached out hesitantly, his small fingers brushing against the wooden bird. The billionaire's breath caught. It was the first time all evening that his son had reached toward something instead of pulling away. The sight filled him with both relief and unease. Relief that his son had found comfort, unease because it wasn't him who provided it. The restaurant remained silent, waiting for the next move. The waitress kept her calm expression, though her heart was racing. She knew the risk she had taken, but she also knew she couldn't just stand by and watch the boy suffer. The billionaire's eyes never left her, a storm of questions building behind his composed face. What exactly had she awakened in his son? And what did it mean for the walls he had built around his carefully controlled life? The answers lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved, leaving the room on edge as the boy clutched the little bird tighter in his hands. The boy's small hands wrapped tightly around the wooden bird, his breathing unsteady but calmer than before. The entire restaurant seemed to be hanging on that fragile moment, afraid that the slightest sound or movement could shatter it. The billionaire leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his son, but beneath his sharp gaze was something no one expected: fear. Fear that the calm would vanish, fear that his child would spiral again, fear that this young waitress had tapped into something he couldn't control. The whispers among the guests grew sharper. Some were astonished, watching as though they were witnessing a miracle unfold. Others remained skeptical, their expressions hard, as if waiting for the boy to scream again so they could confirm their doubts. The businessmen near the door were still muttering complaints, one even pulling out his phone as if ready to document the scene. The billionaire noticed this, and his jaw tightened. For a man who had spent his life protecting his reputation and power, seeing his son reduced to a spectacle in front of strangers ignited a fury he struggled to contain. The waitress, however, didn't glance at the crowd or the father. Her focus never left the boy. She spoke to him softly, words that no one else could hear, her tone steady and rhythmic like a melody only he could understand. The boy's eyes glistened with tears, but there was a flicker of something different now: trust. He clutched the keychain to his chest, rocking slightly, as if her presence had built a bridge into his world. The billionaire's heart pounded as he watched. For years, therapists had told him breakthroughs would take time, patience, and acceptance. But in front of him, in less than 5 minutes, this waitress had done what teams of experts rarely achieved. It was humbling. It was unsettling. And it forced him to confront a truth he had avoided. Maybe his wealth couldn't solve everything. Maybe love and understanding could not be bought. But the tension didn't ease. The restaurant manager had finally stepped forward, his face stiff, clearly torn between protecting the dignity of the establishment and respecting the billionaire's unspoken authority. He glanced at the waitress, his lips pressed into a thin line, as though he was already preparing to scold her for overstepping. The staff behind him shifted nervously, watching every detail. No one knew if this moment would end with praise or with punishment. The boy suddenly let out a sharp cry, causing several guests to flinch. He wasn't screaming like before, but the sound was loud enough to snap the fragile silence. His small body shook, and he pressed the wooden bird against his cheek. The billionaire immediately leaned closer, panic flashing in his eyes, but before he could speak, the waitress gently held out her hand, not touching the boy but offering it like a quiet promise. The boy froze. His wide eyes darted between his father and the waitress. The entire restaurant leaned in, breathless, waiting to see what he would do. Would he retreat into fear, or would he take the step no one dared to expect? The billionaire's chest tightened, his mind racing with what this moment could mean. His reputation, his son's fragile peace, the judgmental stares of the crowd, and the mystery of the waitress's quiet confidence, all collided into a storm that felt seconds away from exploding. And then, in that charged silence, the boy made a choice that would leave the entire room stunned and change the course of the night forever. The boy's tiny fingers loosened their grip on the wooden bird, and in the thick silence of the restaurant, he did something no one expected. He reached, trembling, for the waitress's hand. Gasps rippled across the room as the billionaire's son leaned toward her, a boy who rarely let anyone outside his father near him, let alone trust them. The billionaire's breath caught in his throat, torn between relief and disbelief. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to ease, but then the second twist came crashing in, turning the room colder than before. From the entrance, a voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me, sir," the manager said firmly, his tone edged with discomfort. He gestured toward the waitress, trying to mask his unease. "She needs to step aside. This is not appropriate in front of the guests." His words echoed in the air, each syllable pressing on the fragile calm that had just begun to form. The boy clutched the waitress's hand tighter, a whimper escaping his lips, sensing the shift in energy. The billionaire's eyes darted from his son's trembling face to the manager's stern one. A storm brewed inside him. He had spent years fighting against society's stares, the unkind whispers, the impatient sighs. And now, in this place where people dined on expensive meals and judged from behind crystal glasses, he was being pushed again, this time not for himself but for his son. The waitress, still kneeling, didn't let go. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. Instead, her calm expression spoke louder than words, as though she understood the stakes better than anyone in that room. Her hand remained open, steady, grounding the boy who had finally begun to trust her. The guests exchanged looks, some nodding with the manager, others silently rooting for her courage. But the real shock came from the billionaire himself. He rose slowly from his chair, his towering figure casting a shadow across the table. Every eye followed him as he faced the manager, his expression unreadable. This was not the man of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. It was a father at his breaking point. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. The businessman at the door smirked, expecting the billionaire to lash out at the waitress for daring to interfere. But the truth was, he wasn't angry at her. He was angry at everything. The whispers, the judgment, the lack of understanding his son had faced since the day he was born. His fists tightened at his sides as he fought for words. The boy whimpered again, pressing closer to the waitress, and the billionaire's chest ached at the sight. Just as the silence reached its peak, another unexpected twist unfolded. An older woman, seated near the back, stood up and walked forward. She was a stranger to most in the room, dressed plainly, but her eyes carried a weight of experience. "I know what she's doing," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "My grandson is autistic too." The room froze. The revelation rippled through the crowd, breaking the illusion of perfection that hung over the restaurant. Suddenly, the billionaire wasn't alone in his struggle. But the question burned hotter than ever. Would this moment unite the room in understanding, or would it escalate the conflict into something far more explosive? The older woman's words hung in the air like a quiet thunder, breaking through the wall of judgment that had closed around the table. For the first time that night, the crowd shifted. A few lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier whispers, while others leaned forward, curious and unsettled. The billionaire turned toward her, his sharp expression softening slightly. Here was someone who understood, someone who had lived through the same storms he and his son faced every day. The waitress looked up briefly, meeting the older woman's gaze with a flicker of gratitude before turning her focus back to the boy. He was still holding her hand, calmer now, his small shoulders no longer shaking as violently. The wooden bird rested against his chest, his eyes blinking slowly as if he were beginning to trust the world around him again. The billionaire sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply sit in the moment. Not as a billionaire, not as a man who had to control every detail, but as a father watching his son find peace. The manager, however, remained rigid, his jaw clenched as though he couldn't let go of the rules and order he believed the restaurant demanded. He stepped forward again, ready to insist that the waitress return to her duties. But before he could speak, the billionaire raised his hand. His voice was low but carried a weight that silenced the entire room. "If she leaves," he said firmly, "so do I. And so does every cent I've ever spent here." The statement was a thunderclap. The guests murmured, stunned at the public declaration. The manager froze, pale and shaken, realizing the power in those words. In that moment, the balance of the room shifted. What had begun as judgment turned into respect. The billionaire wasn't defending his wealth. He was defending his son, defending the one person who had dared to show compassion when no one else did. The older woman stepped closer, resting a gentle hand on the waitress's shoulder. "Sometimes," she said softly, "all it takes is patience. Not money, not silence, just patience." The billionaire's chest tightened at her words, a mix of humility and gratitude rising inside him. He gave a small nod, unable to find the right reply. The boy, still clinging to the wooden bird, suddenly turned his face toward his father. For the first time that evening, his eyes met his father's directly. The billionaire leaned closer, his breath catching as his son whispered something faint but clear enough to hear. One simple word. Safe. It was as if the entire room exhaled at once. The waitress blinked back tears, the older woman smiled knowingly, and the billionaire's composure finally cracked. His eyes watered as he placed his hand over his son's, the weight of that single word breaking through every wall he had built around his heart. But just as the tension seemed to dissolve, the final twist struck. The waitress stood slowly, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked at the billionaire. "Your son reminds me of my brother," she said. "He used to hold the same wooden bird. The one you gave to your company's charity years ago." The billionaire froze, the realization hitting him like a wave. That small keychain wasn't random. It had once been part of a donation he himself had made, never knowing where it went. And now, years later, it had circled back into his son's hands, through a waitress who carried her own story of struggle and survival. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't judgment that filled the air, it was awe. The billionaire looked at the waitress, his son, and the wooden bird, realizing that fate had woven them together in ways no one could have predicted. And in that moment he understood. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles come from the simplest acts of human kindness. The billionaire sat frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the waitress as her words sank deeper. The small wooden bird, now clutched against his son's chest, wasn't just a distraction, it was a connection. Years ago, in an attempt to polish his image and contribute to society, he had funded a charity program that distributed handmade toys to children in need. He had written the check and moved on, never truly thinking about where those items ended up or the lives they touched. Now here it was years later in his son's hands, carried by a waitress who had once been part of that unseen story. It was as if life itself had circled back to remind him that real impact didn't come from numbers on a balance sheet, but from small acts that reached human hearts. The room, still hushed, seemed to bend under the weight of that revelation. The boy's fingers traced the grooves of the wooden bird. His eyes calmer now, as if the object carried a secret comfort only he understood. The waitress stood quietly, not basking in the attention, not seeking praise, but simply present. She had risked everything in that moment. Her job, her reputation, because she chose to care. And that was something money could never buy. The billionaire looked around the restaurant. The judgmental stares that had pierced through him earlier were softer now, replaced with something almost like respect. Even the businessmen near the door had fallen silent, their smirks fading as they watched a side of him they had never seen before. A father stripped of power, clinging to his son's fragile trust. He realized, with a strange sense of humility, that this night had forced everyone in the room to confront something uncomfortable. It wasn't about wealth or class. It wasn't about etiquette or rules. It was about understanding what it means to be human. Slowly, he rose from his chair and placed his hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Safe," the boy had whispered earlier, and those words echoed in his mind like a quiet prayer. He turned to the waitress, his voice low but steady. "Thank you," he said. Not the kind of thank you that came with business deals or polite gestures, but one heavy with sincerity. His son still leaned toward her, refusing to let go completely, and the billionaire didn't fight it. Instead, he allowed it, realizing that strength didn't mean always being the one in control. It meant knowing when to let someone else step in. The older woman who had spoken earlier gave a small nod of approval, her eyes glistening with unspoken memories. She returned to her table, leaving behind a ripple of quiet understanding that spread through the room. The manager, red-faced and stiff, took a step back, clearly realizing he had misjudged the moment. No reprimand came. No interruption followed. The silence in the restaurant was no longer tense. It was reverent. As the boy finally eased into his father's arms, still holding the bird tight, the billionaire felt a shift inside him. For so long he had believed that success meant control, that reputation meant everything, that wealth could shield him from pain. But tonight proved the opposite. It wasn't control that healed. It wasn't wealth that made his son feel safe. It was compassion, patience, and the courage of an ordinary waitress who saw beyond the surface. When they finally left the restaurant, the billionaire didn't care about the whispers or the stares. He carried his son in his arms, the wooden bird resting between them, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope that money could never give. Behind him, the waitress quietly returned to her duties, blending back into the background of the dining room. Yet in the billionaire's mind, she was unforgettable. That night would be remembered not for the chaos, but for the reminder it carried. That kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives. The billionaire walked out into the cool night air with his son close against his chest, and in his heart, he knew that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in moments like this. Moments where love, patience, and humanity outshone everything else.